From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Jesse Tack will talk about his new study of the adoption of genetically modified corn over the last 3 decades and how that technology has helped you producers contend with changes in climatic patterns over that time. It's an interesting research take, and Jesse will tell us about it. Also, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti and Kathy Gehl are back to look ahead to the series of K-State Soybean Schools for you producers coming up over the next several weeks. That series has now been expanded to 9 locations in response to the rising interest in soybean production in central and western Kansas. And later, K-State's Charlie Lee on a newly compiled survey on crop damage inflicted by wildlife. All that here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. And welcome once again. Our guest across the way now has devoted quite a lot of research time and effort to the interests about climate change and the impacts on crop production. His latest entry into this body of research is what we'll cover today, looking at genetically engineered corn and how it might help offset the effects of climate change. Jesse Tack is with us. Jesse from the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. Jesse, before we go into your latest work here, this is just one of a series of studies that you've been involved with on climate change as it might reflect on agricultural production, correct?
Yeah, that's true, Eric. I always try and work in the agricultural production sort of space, and with climate change you have a lot of different implications for different facets of production. So can never cover them all, but trying my best to cover at least a few of them. So
what led you to get into this particular question of genetically engineered corn and why it might be important when we look at the future of crop production in the advent of climate change?
Yeah, so started maybe 2 years ago with a colleague in Ag Econ, Nathan Hendricks, and then another colleague at Jason Lusk at Purdue University, kind of just looking at a pretty straightforward question of whether or not there's yield gains associated with the adoption of GE corn. And we looked at the literature, and there's a lot of different answers out there on that, and so we did what we like to do is we went and got as much data as we could, and we estimated some statistical models, and we found that there was kind of evidence of a yield gain for GE corn. And then that was kind of a project that was done a little bit ago, and so a natural question to then ask is what might the implications of technology gains like those we historically experienced when we adopted GE corn, what would be the implications for climate change impacts? One of the things that we kind of like about this particular study with Ariel is it helps us contextualize climate change impacts. So if we have some thought in our head about what those yield gains associated with GE corn were, and then we can sort of compare those to what people are predicting climate change impacts to be, it might help us sort of better contextualize what these climate change impacts are going to look like. Essentially, we can start saying things about how much lost technology we might expect to incur as a result of climate change materializing.
So you put this on something of a timeline, and we want to, again, mention somebody that you referred to right there, Ariel Ortiz-Bobea of Cornell University, your co-author on this.
Yes.
And that timeline, you went back over, 35 years of climate patterns and compared to the evolution of corn, if you will?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to put it. You know, we know that GE corn became available in the States in 1996, and it's been a certain number of years since then, and we wanted to capture sort of a similar time frame before the introduction of those GE crops. So we sort of had a balanced set of observations both before and after GE. So we ended up going back to 1980, and so this yield analysis focused on the years 1980 to 2015.
So it gives you a good baseline to work from, obviously. Noting that in 1996, the genetically engineered technology wasn't very far along in the area of drought tolerance. That's been more recent. The pest control angle was more emphasized at that time, right?
Yeah, one of the things that we cannot do with this study is attribute the yield gains to very specific traits of the GE varieties. So you've got the BT, you've got the Roundup Ready, and more recently, as you noted, the drought tolerance. Well, drought tolerance comes out in 2011, I think. BT and Roundup Ready are there from the get-go, and so, it's likely to be the case, although we haven't tested it directly, it's likely to be the case that the gains that we're estimating with this data set are going to be attributed to the BT and the Roundup Ready traits, and then towards the end of the data set, maybe some of that drought tolerance is creeping in, but even with drought tolerance, you didn't really see the widespread adoption that we saw with the other traits early on. So I don't know the numbers right now, but I think it's been a little bit slower on the adoption side of things. But it points out a really interesting kind of future potential of biotech is, these traits that are providing resistance to heat stresses, drought stresses, not so much the pest, not so much the weed management, kind of a new generation of GE crops. It'll be really interesting to see, as they become more widely adopted in production agriculture, what sort of gains might we see with those? Are they mostly going to be on the profit or cost side of things? Are they going to be on the production efficiency side of things? It'll be interesting to watch that as we move forward.
But back to the correlation that you've established with this comparison, and you do find that there is a relationship between GE corn development and adaptation and yields.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that we are interested in doing is, in order to contextualize those climate change impacts, you kind of need to say something about what yield growth is going to look like in the future. Mm-hmm. And we have no clue what yield growth is going to look like in the future. And we've seen sort of three big periods of yield growth or lack thereof historically with corn production in the U.S. If you go back, prior to 1930s, you've got really flat yields, essentially no yield gain. And then you have the hybrids coming online, and you started seeing, pretty sustained increase in yields up through, 1996 or whenever GE comes about and gets widely adopted. And then you see sort of a slight modification of those yield trends. And if you look at a graph historically of yield trends or yields over time, you don't really pick up the big difference between the hybrids and the GE varieties. But if you actually look at the numbers, the associated yield gains year after year they're big enough to make a difference. So that was one of the things we were interested in doing with this project. We don't know what yield trends are going to look like in the future, but maybe we can sort of put some bounds on that with some different periods of time that we've seen in the historical data.
So those yield gains in a percentage term or in raw numbers, how did you express that here?
Yeah, so with this particular research, when we estimated these gains, it was a percentage gain per year. And in that period of 1980 to 1995, sort of that pre-GE technology period, we saw gains that averaged about 1 percentage point per year. After 1996, we see that percentage gain per year jump up to 1.5%. So it's not really, it doesn't jump out at you when you look at yields over time, but when you actually go in and measure those differences, it's a pretty substantial change.
It's cumulative then, right?
Well,
or is it?
These numbers are percentage points per year, and then if you wanted to go from sort of a percentage change to a yield level change, you'd have to take into account that cumulative effect. So backing out our estimates, we get a yield gain of about 15 bushels per acre in sort of an absolute yield level sense.
So you feel confident that you've established that relationship through this analysis?
I would say this. We're looking at sort of a big picture analysis of yields, and we're going to try and estimate yield trend differences across two different periods of time. But GE isn't the only thing that's changing across those two periods. So you've got a lot of other new technologies that are coming on after 1996. So we can't take this study in isolation and say, okay, this is the GE effect. best we can do is estimate the differences, see what that sort of implies in terms of those yield gains, and then we can compare it to sort of field trial-based studies or other sort of observational-based studies in the literature. And that's, where we can kind of make our comparison of 15 bushels per acre to other studies, and it's in line with what other studies that can more accurately attribute that GE effect specific to this new technology. It's in line with the estimates from a number of other studies.
So, Jesse, the end message that you're hoping comes out of this work is that potentially genetically engineered corn can contribute to offsetting the effects of climate change?
Yes and no. So it's a really good question. We've sort of exhausted the gains from the first evolution of genetically engineered corn. We need to replicate that. We need to do that again to offset these climate change impacts under sort of our worst case, business as usual, CO2 emissions don't go down sort of scenario. So it's a little bit tricky with the interpretation. We've experienced these yield gains. We need to do it again in order to offset these climate change impacts.
And so you and colleagues will be furthering your research into this area, it sounds.
I think so, yeah. It's a fun space to work in. It's always changing. There's a lot of interesting questions still to be researched in this area for sure, yeah.
And at the same time, as you pursue that, the technology in and of itself will continue to evolve. So you have to bring what's new into the fold at the same time.
Yeah, it's going to be really exciting to see what the new gene editing technologies like CRISPR are going to do in sort of the biotech crop space. And again, just like yield trends going forward, it's really hard to predict what that new evolution of biotech crops is going to look like. But it seems like there's definitely some more innovations ahead of us.
It is intriguing work. Continuing on with it, we wish you well. And thanks, Jesse, for the quick summary right here.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate your time.
He's an agricultural economist here at K-State, and along with a peer out of Cornell University, Ariel Ortiz-Bobea, conducted this study of genetically engineered corn, whether or not that technology can help respond to the impacts of climate change and as far as yield productivity. Jesse's been our guest on this part of Agriculture Today, and we'll return in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. We're back now on this Agriculture Today and taking this opportunity to remind you soybean growers around Kansas that K-State Research and Extension will be hosting in the coming days and weeks a series of 2019 Soybean Schools for you. And we'll cover the details right now with two of the individuals responsible for putting these on. Ignacio Ciampitti is a crop production specialist, Kathy Gehl, an extension program coordinator, both from the Department of Agronomy here at K-State. So welcome back to the two of you. And Ignacio, we'll ask you to share the intent behind these soybean schools in that this past growing season there were usual and unusual challenges to soybean production.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric, again for the invitation, as always. I think that the schools are excellent opportunity as to have one place that farmers can stop, and get all the information about updates from past growing season, current management practices in order to, maximize profits and look at the next growing season. It's also a good opportunity to refresh us, the challenges that we have seen in the last year. Multiple challenges. Some of the few that we will be touching base, specifically on the weed control. That's one of the main topics. Looking at still the challenges of controlling weeds on soybeans is number one issue for soybean farmers across the state. A particularly issue last year also related to harvest conditions. And I think that is very fresh for everyone still because many of our farmers were harvesting soybeans during Christmas time, or they are still having some soybeans on the ground. Hopefully we have very few or nothing on the ground. One of our main concerns in terms of that is basically we have seen loss on test weight. We have been seeing challenges in terms of plant standing, health, and quality. So we will be discussing a little bit on these topics, specifically also focusing a little bit on the quality side. Basically, these problems of protein content based on the growing conditions that we have late in the season. And then we will be touching base, as always, about expectations on the markets. Always that's a typical question, what the markets will do. We will have Dan O'Brien in some of the schools. But again, one of the main ideas on working in collaboration with Kansas Soybeans, which are the main sponsors of our schools, is to provide to the farmers this idea of having one place that they can just stop and get all the information that they need in order to be ready for the next growing season. As a new feature for this coming year is we move from 3 schools to 9. So basically if we're looking at our soybean acres are continuing to grow. When we move from central to west part of the state, I think that we need more and more information going into that direction. So our Soybean Commission folks decided that this is also a good option to start moving information into central to west part of the state. And then we have schools that they will go all the western part of the state, going southwest, west central, northwest. Then we'll have in central and 3 schools there also, going north central, south central, and central part. And then we'll move to the eastern part. That typically previous years, that was most our target, the central part and the eastern portion. And clearly we are seeing how soybeans are moving into the west territory of the state. So we decided that was a good opportunity. And then the folks from Kansas Soybeans are really gratefully providing the funds to support these schools. So the schools are free to attend for every farmer. We'll provide more information right now. Kathy will specify on location and speakers and registration. But we really ask everyone, please reserve your seats. Register. That helps us to provide, a good kind of a head count number for meals also. And it's really relevant for us to have these numbers in advance.
We'll go over registration procedures and the dates and locations, of course, of each of these. But as Ignacio is saying, Kathy, these 9 schools are well scattered throughout the state, but each is tailored to the individual production issues and topics that would be appropriate to that location, right?
That's correct, Eric. Each school will feature some similar themes. They will all have a weeds component. As we all know, soybeans, weed pressure is a very big issue. They will all have an insect talk. They will all have a crop production topic as well. But as you move from the east to the west, you'll see the other topics will shift depending on the growing conditions and the challenges associated with those areas. The eastern portion of the state will have a disease component. You will start to see some irrigation come in on the western side of the state because, the goal is to keep these programs targeted and specific to the growers for those regions and make them have the most of their time coming to these programs.
For producers in, say, the western reaches of the state that don't have a number of years behind them in soybean production, there will be information here for them to, put it this way, get rolling in this crop, right? Exactly.
Definitely these will be good opportunities for growers that haven't had as much exposure to soybeans in those parts of the state to be able to ask questions, to talk to these experts, our agronomists and our different specialists with KSRE. It'll be a great opportunity for them.
And Ignacio, the idea here is for producers to bring their questions, and specifically we'll have an opportunity to raise those questions before the speakers, right? Yeah, and the goal of the schools are basically the format changed this year since a number of locations. We trying to condense the schools to pack them into formats that they will be 3-4 hours duration. And the idea is to provide updates. We are not asking speakers, except for a specific topic like a weed control that requires probably more time. But the rest of the topics, we basically will focus on quick updates. And our goal is to make sure that we have more interaction. So we are asking those farmers to make sure that they come up with the questions. We will have multiple specialists. This is a good opportunity for those farmers, even when they have challenges or topic or production issues that they might imply more
that just one discipline. So, and this is an excellent opportunity to have the crop specialist, the insect and entomology person and the disease person all in one room, to discuss about all the challenges that we have been facing in the last year.
No fee required to attend these, but Kathy, you and Ignacio want producers to pre-register because there is a meal associated with each program.
Exactly. The Soybean Commission and other funding has really come through for us to provide a good meal at each of these locations with also refreshments and snacks as well. So registration is key for us to make sure that we have plenty of that on hand and that we have a good idea of what our attendance is going to be. You can go to the K-State Agronomy e-update website to register. There's also a link that if you go, you can just type this into your search bar, bit.ly/KSU soybean, and it will take you directly to the registration page. It's very quick. It doesn't take very long, and it allows you to pick the location that you would like to register for.
And if nothing else, if producers would rather, they can contact their local extension office in the hosting counties to take care of this as well, can they not?
Exactly. Yep, that is definitely an option for them. If they don't want to go online and try to search for that, they can contact their extension office, and the registration will get to us. It's important that we have an email address for people that are wanting to come to these because it is January in Kansas. And I know last year our Phillipsburg school, I believe, had to be rescheduled for much later because of snow. So we would like to be able to have contact information to make sure everyone's aware of any kind of schedule changes.
Simply search for K-State Soybean Schools to register. If you didn't catch that direct web address, that's an easy way to go about this as well. But lastly, Ignacio, the encouragement is out there for soybean producers to take one of these in that they've now 9 opportunities to do so.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent opportunity of just finding all the information that they need in one place. Another thing for our agronomy consultants, we will be offering credits. So we are offering CCA credits and we are offering commercial pesticide applicator credits. For anyone that needs credits, those credits have been applied for, and then we will be offering credits at all the locations. The last comment on the schools, when you are registering, or even if you provide information to your county contact office, make sure that you clarify what is the time of the school, since we will have in so many locations 2 schools every day. So we'll have one running usually from 8:30 to 1 p.m. With meal included, and then the second one running from 3 to 7 p.m. So make sure to check, not only the location, but also the time, the duration of the schools.
Very well. The best to both of you in pulling these off very soon, and thanks for coming over. We'll run through the dates and locations here very shortly. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
K-State's Kathy Gehl and Ignacio Ciampitti telling us about the 2019 K-State Soybean Schools, 9 of them this year. And here's where they'll take place and when. January the 15th, that's a Tuesday, in Wichita, starting at 8:30 in the morning. And in Parsons at 3 in the afternoon on the 15th. January 16th, Wednesday, Paola, 8:30 a.m. Holton at 3 o'clock that afternoon on the 16th. Then the following week, January the 24th, a Thursday, in Hugoton, southwest Kansas, 8:30 start time there. Later that afternoon on the 24th in Scott City at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And on January the 25th, Friday, Hoxie, 8:30 in the morning. That's in northwest Kansas. Great Bend in central Kansas, 3 o'clock on the 25th. Lastly, the 28th of January, Monday, one taking place in Beloit at 9 o'clock in the morning. He's sponsored by K-State Research and Extension and, of course, the Kansas Soybean Commission. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are listening to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. Once more, glad to have you along. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And beginning with good news, China has approved imports of 5 new varieties of genetically modified crops, paving the way for U.S. agricultural firms to sell more biotech seeds to Chinese buyers as Beijing and Washington seek to ease trade tensions. The approvals, which include soybeans, canola, and corn products, come as U.S. and Chinese officials met in Beijing to hammer out details on a number of broad pledges recently made by the Chinese leadership. China last made new approvals of genetically modified crops from the U.S. back in June of 2017. The list of approvals released by the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs today includes a Dow-DuPont corn hybrid and soybean variety and a BASF Syngenta soybean. The ministry also granted approvals for a BASF canola variety and a Bayer glyphosate-tolerant canola line. In addition to the 5 new approvals, 26 other genetically modified crop varieties were given renewed approvals for importing into China. For the U.S. farm sector, this move is another step toward clearing a backlog of biotech seeds that have awaited approval from China, in some cases for years. The announcement opened the door for more imports of agricultural products from the U.S., although it's difficult to gauge the exact impact. That's according to He Yu-jin, a soybean analyst at a commodities consultancy firm based in eastern Shandong province. If the trade talks go smoothly, China will for sure import more soybeans from the U.S., said Mr. He, but he added it's still too early to say by how much. Farm Bill implementation, trade aid, and scrutiny of the USDA's plan to relocate the Economic Research Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture are among the top priorities for the House Agriculture Committee under its new chairman, Collin Peterson of Minnesota. Peterson returns to the top spot on the committee after Democrats regained control of the House in the November midterm elections. It will be his second stint as chairman, having previously served in that role from 2007 to 2011, and he has served as ranking member since. For the committee, there is no shortage of work to be done, Peterson said in a statement. He added, there is a new farm bill to implement, a growing economic storm in farm country to address, and the ongoing harm of a trade war to alleviate, not to mention the range of unforeseen issues that will test the mettle of the people we are here to serve, in Peterson's comments. On trade, the committee is expected to review the impacts retaliatory tariffs by China and others are having on the U.S. agricultural sector. The USDA announced a trade aid plan for farmers meant to mitigate those duties, of course, but already there are calls to extend that program beyond the initial $12 billion aid package currently underway. And Bayer-owned Monsanto has received a major boost in its bid to fend off hundreds of federal lawsuits that allege the company failed to warn consumers about the cancer risks from its glyphosate-based herbicides. The California federal judge overseeing some 620 complaints brought by cancer victims granted Bayer's request to split an upcoming bellwether trial into 2 parts. That's a move that will restrict the evidence the plaintiff's attorneys can use to try to convince the jury that the company attempted to influence regulators and sway public opinion about the cancer risks from the herbicides. The first phase of the trial will focus on causation and consider whether the plaintiffs can prove that exposure to Monsanto's glyphosate-based herbicides caused them to develop non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. If the plaintiffs can show causation, the trial will move to a second phase to address all remaining liability and damage issues. This according to U.S. District Judge Vincent Jabria. He explained this in his order. That applies to the first of 3 bellwether cases. That trial is set to begin on February the 25th. On we go now to this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning actually some good news in the dairy industry. I know over the last several months there's been a lot of bad news, and I know as you look at your margins on your farm that probably isn't the news you'd actually like to hear. But, you know, there's some interesting things going on with consumption of dairy products here in the United States. So we look over the trends over the last several years. Actually, the consumption of dairy products continues to rise. And that's a good thing as we look for new ways to market some of the milk that we are producing. So if you think things are bad now, just imagine what it would be like if we did not have a rise in per capita consumption here in the United States. So it is a positive thing that we're seeing. As you look at where we're seeing that rise, it's really kind of interesting. The trend line since 1975 would indicate that the last 3 years we've actually departed from that trend line in the consumption of total dairy products here in the U.S. Actually, an increase, and actually a marked increase over what it has been in the previous years. Now, where we consume those products is probably a little bit more interesting. One of the things that continues to lag in the United States is the per capita consumption of fluid milk. And in fact, in the last 4 years, we've actually seen a departure on the negative side from the overall trend line over the last several decades. However, that has been offset by what we see happening in cheese consumption. Cheese consumption in the United States continues to be strong and continues to grow. Greatest growth is actually in the area of Italian cheeses. However, in the last few years, we've actually seen a growth in American cheese as well as cheddar cheese, which is kind of interesting because in the past those two had been kind of lagging behind, but in the last 3 to 4 years we've actually seen a gain there as well. Some other things that are going on in terms of consumption of dairy products, we've seen actually a leveling off in yogurt consumption. For about 10 years, there was a steady increase in yogurt consumption. And starting in about 2013, 2014, we saw that level off, and that's continued to be the case, although it still accounts for a sizable amount of the milk solids produced in the United States. It's not growing like it was in the past. So when we look at some of the other products that are still growing in consumption, butter continues to post good growth over time, which is a good thing when we think about getting rid of some of the milk solids that we are continuing to produce. So in general, what does this mean to the dairy farm here in Kansas? Well, it means that American consumers still see dairy products as a very important part of their diet, and they're increasing the inclusion of those products in their diet. That increases the amount of milk that we can put through the system, so to speak, here in the United States. So that's very positive for what we need to do in terms of the continual growth that we see in our dairy herd here in the U.S. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today is back now. Charlie Lee is aboard once again, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, you've to share this week a new survey of wildlife damage to crops, and the extent of this report is pretty impressive. It's a long-term view of that damage, you say.
Yes, this particular survey illustrates the perceptions of agriculture and wildlife leaders in 30-year intervals. The first one of these surveys was done in 1957, which was the first survey that I could find information about concerning the impact of wildlife damage. Then again in 1987, and again in 2017. It was a little bit different approach. The study was conducted with 3 main groups. The first group would be the head of each state fish and wildlife agency. The second group was the chief executive officer of the state farm bureaus, and the last group was the state extension wildlife specialist. It was a fairly short survey. They sent it out to those folks, did the follow-up, make sure they got a good return rate, and basically asked them to kind of fill in the blank. Which species causes the most damage in your state? As they try to deal with continuing problems and the concern that Eventually, more wildlife means more wildlife damage. More wildlife damage is usually impacts agriculture, farms, and ranches the most because that's the most common land use that we have out there. When you look at it nationwide, more than 44% of the land use is in farms and ranches in the United States, but we have anomalies there, like Kansas, where 88% of Kansas is in farmland and ranches. Only about 300,000 acres of Kansas is owned in federal lands, with 5 national parks. On those federal lands, I get a lot of concern from people about, well, they're not paying taxes. We do get payments in lieu of taxes of just a little bit over $1 million for those federal lands. But we have less than 2% of Kansas is open to public hunting. Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks have done a great job with their walk-in hunting access program and walk-in fishing program. There's now about 1.7 million acres of Kansas that's open to public hunting, but that includes the land that Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism leases through the walk-in hunting program. It's kind of ironic that Kansas, Texas, and Iowa, 3 states that have less than 1/10 of an acre per person, open for public hunting. So I think state agencies have to take a good hard look at how much land is available for public use and hunting. At the same time, they're trying to implement wildlife habitat management programs. Perhaps there's an upper limit on the number of wildlife that we need to produce. I think state agencies are very much aware of that and try to control that with hunting seasons and number of animals that can be taken.
But there seems to be cross purposes here when you think of it that way.
Yeah, it certainly is a paradox in that when you have state agencies that their goal is creating wildlife habitat to increase wildlife viewing or hunting opportunities for all of the public, at the same time you're doing that, wildlife damage increases. That's probably a direct function of the density of animals that are out there. And at times those wildlife damages or most directly impact the agricultural producers.
So this study was exhaustive, you'd have to say that. What is the number one wildlife damage problem that crop producers face?
Well, most of the time it's deer. Deer came out as number one in 1987 as well as in 2017. But there were 21 different species that were listed as being the most important in their state. So you can see that the breadth of the problem is not just deer. Some states have significant issues with other species, and it's a big country, lots of problems.
And when you think of a state like Kansas, such as coyotes or even feral hogs, they rank high?
Yeah, and I would agree that in Kansas it would get a considerable number of deer complaints. Feral hogs, maybe not so much. Coyotes cause a lot of problems. Canada geese would be the top 4, and I think those certainly are the top 4 that are kind of the charismatic species, those species that are large enough for a lot of people to see and to view. Personally, I think if we looked at pure dollars lost, I think there would be more a negative impact to agricultural producers caused by small rodents. That didn't show up as the top species from anyone in those years, which was surprising to me.
Did this study account for the type of crop damage?
Well, it looked at what types of crops were damaged. And again, perhaps not surprising, grains would be the crop that was damaged most frequently or mentioned as being damaged most frequently. Hay would have been next, berries and fruit, then vegetables. So I was surprised that orchards wasn't a little higher in that list, particularly when you look at some of the new genetic work that's been done with fruit trees and how now there are more dwarf varieties out there. The shorter varieties makes a higher percentage of that crop accessible to deer because those of you that have had problems with deer in your yard realize that sometimes deer will stand on their hind legs to feed, and the shorter tree means a higher percentage of that tree can be damaged.
So, in the main, the message out of this is that in at least some cases, redoubling efforts to manage that damage would be in order here.
I think agencies are going to have to realize that, yes, damage management must be a part of wildlife management. We cannot just continue to increase numbers of wildlife across the landscape without very carefully considering the damage that they might cause. And I think state agencies do that somewhat, but it's easy to forget about providing funds available to help producers manage the damage. Currently, we can articulate the damage problems, but are we offering adequate tools for producers to enable them to solve the problems?
Well, those are the main indicators from this brand new survey, and an extensive one at that, once again, of wildlife damage to crop production across the nation. Charlie, thanks for the look at this. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Well, once again, our time is away. As always, we thank you for being along with us and invite you to rejoin us this same time tomorrow right here. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.